The woman who stepped off the westbound train in Lusk, Wyoming, that scorching July afternoon in 1882, carried nothing but a worn carpetbag and eyes that held more stories than her lips would ever tell. Lydia Evermore moved through the dusty platform with careful steps, her dark blue traveling dress already gathering the pale dirt that seemed to coat everything in this frontier town. And when the station master asked if someone was meeting her, she simply nodded once and said nothing more. Her silence was not shyness or rudeness, but something deeper, something that had settled into her bones during the 3,000 miles from Boston to this windswept corner of the Wyoming Territory, where the prairie stretched endlessly, and the sky seemed bigger than God himself. She had not spoken a single word to another passenger during the entire journey west. When the woman sitting beside her from Chicago to Omaha had tried to make pleasant conversation about the weather and the adventure of Western travel, Lydia had simply smiled politely and turned her face toward the window. When the conductor asked for her ticket, she handed it to him without a sound. When children ran through the aisles laughing and their mothers apologized, Lydia merely nodded her understanding. The silence had become her armor, her protection, the only thing she could control when everything else in her life had shattered like crystal dropped on marble floors. The town of Lusk was smaller than she had imagined, though she was not sure what she had expected. A main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a hotel that looked barely sturdy enough to withstand the wind, a general store with its windows displaying goods she would need to learn the names of in this new life. Horses tied to hitching posts swished their tails against flies, and men in dusty work clothes moved with purpose from one establishment to another. She could see the livery stable at the far end of town, smell the mixture of horse and hay, and something cooking that made her stomach remind her she had not eaten since early morning. Lydia stood on the platform as other passengers dispersed, claimed by family or friends, or simply walking off with the confidence of people who knew where they were going. She waited because her cousin's letter had said someone would meet her, someone reliable who could take her to the small house that was now hers through inheritance from an aunt she had met only twice in childhood. The inheritance was modest, barely enough to survive on, but it was 3,000 miles from Boston and from memories that would not let her sleep, and that distance was worth more than gold. Miss Evermore. The voice came from behind her, low and careful, and when she turned she saw a man who looked like he had been carved from the same landscape that surrounded them. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate simply, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of worn leather. His hat was pushed back slightly, revealing brown hair that needed cutting, and his clothes were clean but faded from years of washing and wearing. He held his hat in his hands now, a gesture of respect that seemed natural to him. Lydia nodded. "I am Wesley Davenport. Your cousin Sarah asked me to meet you and see you settled. I have a wagon waiting." He spoke simply, no unnecessary words, and she appreciated that. She nodded again and gestured toward her carpetbag. Wesley picked it up as though it weighed nothing, which it nearly did since she had left almost everything behind, and led her toward a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. He helped her up onto the seat with a gentle hand under her elbow, then went around to the other side and climbed up beside her. The horses started forward at his quiet command, and they left the small cluster of buildings that made up the heart of Lusk, heading east on a rutted road that wound through grassland dotted with sage. "Your aunt's place is about 5 miles out," Wesley said, keeping his eyes on the road. "It is a good house, solid. She kept it well. There is a garden plot and a chicken coop, though the chickens wandered off after she passed. I have been checking on it weekly to make sure everything stayed sound. Sarah said you would be coming to stay. Lydia nodded, grateful he did not seem to expect conversation. She watched the landscape roll past, so different from anything she had ever known. The vastness of it pressed against her chest, but not unpleasantly. In Boston, buildings had crowded close and people had crowded closer, everyone always in everyone else's business, everyone knowing the gossip, the tragedy, the shame. Here there was space enough to breathe, space enough to disappear if that was what a person needed. Wesley drove in comfortable silence for a while, and Lydia found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. He had the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors, but there was a gentleness in the way he handled the horses, speaking to them in a low voice when they needed encouragement over a rough patch of road. His hands on the reins were strong but not harsh, and she noticed he wore no wedding ring, though that meant little out here where such niceties were often abandoned for practicality. If you need anything once you are settled, I run cattle on the land north of your property, Wesley said after a long stretch of quiet. It is not a big operation, just me and 2 hands, but I am usually around. Sarah said you might need help getting oriented to how things work out here. It is different from city living. Lydia pulled a small notebook from her pocket and a pencil, wrote quickly, and held it out to him. Wesley glanced at it and read, "Thank you for your kindness." He handed it back without comment, without the question she could see forming behind his eyes. "You are welcome," was all he said, and she felt something tight in her chest loosen just slightly. The house appeared on the horizon like a promise. It was small, single-story, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to silver gray, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch that wrapped around the front and one side. There was indeed a garden plot, overgrown now with weeds, and the chicken coop Wesley had mentioned, and a small barn that leaned slightly but still stood. Beyond the house, the prairie rolled away in every direction, broken only by a line of cottonwood trees that marked where a creek must run. Wesley pulled the wagon up close to the front door and set the brake. He climbed down and came around to help Lydia, and she took his hand to steady herself as she stepped down. The touch was brief and businesslike, but she noticed his palm was calloused and warm, the hand of a man who worked with it every day of his life. "Let me show you inside," he said, and produced a key from his pocket. The door opened onto a single large room that served as kitchen and living area, with a bedroom partitioned off at the back, and a loft space above that could be reached by a ladder. The furniture was simple but sturdy: a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, a cast iron stove for cooking, shelves lined with dishes and preserves in dusty jars. Everything was as her aunt had left it, frozen in time from the moment her heart had given out while she knelt in her garden pulling carrots. "I will bring in more water for you," Wesley said. "The well is good, never runs dry even in late summer. There is wood stacked behind the house for the stove and fireplace. I brought supplies from town, basic things Sarah thought you would need right away. They are in the wagon." For the next hour, Lydia watched as Wesley made multiple trips from the wagon, bringing in a box of supplies, filling the water bucket from the well, checking the stove to make sure the flue was clear, testing the door hinges and latches. He worked efficiently and without fuss, and she found herself noticing the way he moved, economical and sure, nothing wasted. When he was satisfied that everything was in working order, he stood in the doorway with his hat back on his head and looked at her seriously. "Miss Evermore, I know it is not my place, but Sarah is worried about you. She said you have been through something difficult and that you needed a fresh start somewhere quiet. This land can be hard on people who are not used to it, especially going into winter. I do not mean to pry into your business, but I want you to know that if you need help with anything, anything at all, you can count on me. My place is straight north about 2 miles. You will see the house from the rise behind your barn." Lydia felt her eyes sting unexpectedly at the simple kindness in his words. She reached for her notebook again and wrote carefully before showing him. "Why are you helping me? You do not know me." Wesley read it and was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "Your Aunt Martha was good to me when I first came to this territory 5 years ago. I was green as grass, did not know a thing about running cattle, and she gave me sound advice more than once. Helped me through my first winter when I thought I might freeze or starve before spring came. She never asked for anything in return, just said that was how neighbors ought to be. I figure helping her kin is the least I can do." He paused, then added, "And Sarah is a good friend. She asked me to look after you, and I gave her my word." Lydia nodded, understanding. In this place, apparently, a person's word still meant something. She wrote again, "I will try not to be a burden." "You are not a burden," Wesley said firmly. "You are a neighbor, and that is different." He touched the brim of his hat. "I will come by tomorrow if that is all right. Make sure everything is working as it should. In the meantime, try to get some rest. It is a long journey from Boston." After he left, driving the wagon back down the rutted road toward his own property, Lydia stood on the porch and watched until he disappeared from view. Then she went inside and sat in the rocking chair and let herself feel, for the first time since leaving Massachusetts, the full weight of everything she had run from. She had been engaged to be married. His name had been Charles Whitmore, and he had been handsome and charming and from one of the best families in Boston. Her parents had been thrilled, her friends envious. The wedding was to be in October, just 3 months away, and she had been happy in the way young women are supposed to be happy when their future is settled and bright. Then one evening in April, she had returned early from a charitable ladies' meeting that had been canceled, and found Charles in her father's study with Thomas Henderson, another young man from their social circle, locked in an embrace that left no doubt about the true nature of their relationship. The scandal that followed had been swift and brutal. Charles had denied everything, claimed she was hysterical and imagining things, and his family's influence had been enough to make most of society believe him. But enough people had their doubts, and the engagement had been quietly broken. Her reputation had been damaged not by what she had seen, but by the fact that she had spoken of it at all. Good women did not acknowledge such things, did not make waves, did not force society to look at what it preferred to ignore. The whispers had followed her everywhere. At church, in shops, at social gatherings she could no longer avoid attending. Her mother had stopped speaking to her beyond what was absolutely necessary, angry that Lydia had not simply kept quiet and married Charles anyway. Her father had retreated into his business and pretended nothing had happened. Friends had fallen away like leaves in autumn. And slowly, week by week, Lydia had found that her own voice disappeared. What was the point of speaking when no one wanted to hear the truth? When her words only brought more judgment and pain by the time the letter arrived from the lawyer in Wyoming, informing her that her Aunt Martha had passed and left her a small property, Lydia had not spoken aloud in 2 months. She wrote notes when she needed to communicate, or simply went without communicating at all. Her parents had been relieved when she announced she was going west. It solved their problem, removed their difficult daughter from sight, let them tell their friends she had gone to make a new life on the frontier, which sounded adventurous and brave rather than disgraced and exiled. Now, in this small house on the edge of vast emptiness, Lydia rocked slowly and let the tears come. She cried for the innocence she had lost, for the future she had imagined that would never be, for the voice she had locked away because using it had only brought pain. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she went into the bedroom and lay down on the narrow bed and fell into the deepest sleep she had had in months. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, the sun rising over the prairie with a brightness that made her squint. Lydia washed her face in the basin, changed into a simpler dress more suitable for the work she could see waiting for her, and went outside to assess her new domain. The garden plot was a disaster of weeds, but she could see beneath them the remnants of what had been vegetables and herbs. The barn needed repairs but could be made serviceable. The chicken coop would need chickens, which meant a trip to town or to a neighboring farm. She was standing in the garden, pulling weeds with methodical determination, when she heard a horse approaching. Wesley rode up on a good-looking bay gelding, and he had another horse on a lead behind him, a gentle-eyed mare the color of honey. "Morning," he called as he dismounted. "I brought Clara here for you. She is steady and knows the country. I thought you might need a way to get around that does not involve walking miles." He led the mare closer, and Lydia wiped her dirty hands on her apron and reached out to stroke the horse's soft nose. Clara nickered quietly and bumped her hand, looking for treats. Lydia pulled out her notebook. "I do not know how to ride." "I figured as much," Wesley said. "I can teach you if you want. It is not hard once you get the feel of it, and Clara is patient. She taught my youngest hand everything he knows about sitting a horse." Over the next hour, Wesley showed her how to saddle Clara, how to check the cinch, how to hold the reins properly. Then he boosted her up into the saddle and walked beside them in a wide circle around the yard, talking to her in that same low, calm voice he used with the horses, telling her how to sit, how to move with the animal rather than against it, how to ask for what she wanted with gentle pressure rather than force. "You have good hands," he said after a while. "Soft but steady. That is what you want. A horse will respond better to a whisper than a shout." Lydia found herself smiling just a little at the pleasure of it, the height, the movement, the sense of partnership with the animal beneath her. Wesley smiled back when he saw her expression, and it transformed his serious face into something warmer, more open. "You are a natural," he said. "Give it a few more days of practice and you will be riding out on your own." He stayed through the morning, helping her clear the worst of the weeds from the garden, fixing the broken hinge on the barn door, checking the roof for leaks. They worked in companionable silence, and Lydia found she did not mind his presence the way she had minded the pressing company of people in Boston. Wesley did not expect her to entertain him or explain herself. He simply worked beside her, occasionally pointing something out or showing her a better way to do a task, and otherwise left her to her thoughts. When the sun was high and hot, she brought out bread and cheese and cold water from the well, and they sat on the porch steps eating. Wesley told her about the area, the ranches and small farms scattered across the prairie, the town of Lusk and its people, what to expect when winter came and the snow piled high. He spoke easily, not seeming to notice or care that she never answered aloud, accepting her nods and occasional written notes as sufficient response. "There is a dance in town once a month," he said, then caught himself. "Though I suppose that might not interest you." Lydia shook her head and wrote, "I do not dance any more." "That is all right," Wesley said. "Most of the time I just stand in the corner and watch anyway. I am not much for socializing." He paused, studying the horizon. "But the people are good here mostly. If you ever want company, there are neighbors who would welcome you. Sarah said she would come visit once you were settled." Over the following days, Wesley came by each morning, always finding some reason, some task that needed doing, some lesson about frontier life that he needed to teach her. He showed her how to shoot the rifle that had belonged to her aunt, teaching her to sight down the barrel and squeeze the trigger slowly. The kick surprised her, and she stumbled back into him, and his hands steadied her shoulders with a touch that lingered just a moment longer than necessary. "You did good," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Next time plant your feet wider. You are stronger than you think." He taught her to recognize the signs of weather changing, how to read the sky and the behavior of animals. He taught her which plants on the prairie were useful and which were poison, walking with her through the grassland and pointing out sage and yucca and wild roses. He taught her to tend the stove so the fire would last through the night, to make bread that did not turn out like rocks, to preserve vegetables for winter. And slowly, day by day, Lydia felt herself coming back to life in small, quiet ways. The silence between them was different from the silence she had carried from Boston. That silence had been hollow, empty, a void where her voice used to be. This silence with Wesley was full, rich with unspoken understanding. They communicated in glances and gestures and the occasional written note, but mostly they just worked together, and that was enough. 3 weeks after her arrival, Wesley brought a wagon loaded with lumber. "I thought we could extend your chicken coop," he said. "Make it bigger, more secure against predators. Then we can get you some hens from the Miller farm. Mrs. Miller has more than she needs and would be happy to sell you a dozen." They spent 2 days building, Wesley measuring and sawing while Lydia held boards in place and hammered nails under his instruction. Her hands blistered and her back ached, but there was satisfaction in watching the structure take shape under their combined effort. On the evening of the second day, when they stood back to admire the finished coop, Wesley turned to her with a smile that made her heart do something strange in her chest. "We make a good team," he said simply. Lydia pulled out her notebook, hesitated, then wrote, "Why do you keep helping me?" "You must have your own work to do." Wesley read the note and was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, as though he was weighing each word. "At first, I was keeping a promise to Sarah and honoring your aunt's memory. But these past weeks, I have been coming because I want to, because I look forward to seeing you each morning, because working beside you is the best part of my day." He looked at her directly, his brown eyes serious. "I know I am probably out of line saying that, and if it makes you uncomfortable, I will stop coming by so often. But I wanted you to know." Lydia's hand shook as she wrote, "It does not make me uncomfortable." Something shifted in Wesley's expression, hope and relief mixed together. "Good," he said. "That is good." That night, lying in her bed, Lydia thought about his words and about the way she felt when she was with him. Safe in a way she had not felt safe in a very long time. Seen, even without speaking. Valued for her work, her effort, her presence, rather than for how well she performed the role society had assigned her. Wesley did not expect her to be anything other than what she was, silence and all. The next morning when he arrived, she had coffee waiting and eggs fried in the way he liked them. They ate breakfast together on the porch, watching the sun paint the prairie gold and amber, and neither of them mentioned what had been said the evening before. But the knowledge of it hung between them, sweet and terrifying all at once. As summer deepened into August, Wesley began arriving earlier and staying later. His cattle were tended by his 2 hands while he helped Lydia transform her small homestead into something viable and self-sufficient. The garden flourished under their care, producing more vegetables than she could eat alone. The chickens arrived, a dozen red hens that clucked contentedly in their new home and began laying eggs within days. Wesley fixed the lean on the barn and helped her stock it with hay for Clara. He mended the roof and replaced a cracked window pane and built her a proper woodshed, so her winter fuel would stay dry. And Lydia watched him work, memorizing the lines of his face, the way his hands moved with such sureness, the sound of his voice when he spoke to the horses, or read aloud from the newspaper he brought from town. She caught herself wanting to speak to him, words forming in her mind that never made it past her lips. Small things at first, thank you. The coffee is hot, look at the sunset, but then larger things. I was engaged once. I ran away from a scandal. I forgot how to use my voice because no one wanted to hear it. I think I might be falling in love with you, and it terrifies me. One afternoon in late August, they were sitting on the porch after working in the garden, drinking cold water and watching storm clouds build on the western horizon. Wesley had been quieter than usual all day, and finally he set down his cup and turned to face her. "Lydia, can I tell you something?" She nodded, her heart suddenly beating faster. "I was married once," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "Her name was Anne. We met in Kansas before I came to Wyoming, got married young, maybe too young. She was beautiful and lively, and I thought I was the luckiest man alive." He paused, staring at his hands. She hated frontier life, hated the isolation, the hard work, the lack of society and entertainment. She tried for a year, but she was miserable every day of it. Finally, she left, went back east to her family and sent me divorce papers, said she would rather be alone in civilization than married on the frontier. Lydia reached over and put her hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort. "That was 3 years ago," Wesley continued. "I have not looked at another woman since, have not wanted to. Told myself I was better off alone, that I was not cut out for marriage, that work was enough." He looked at her then, his eyes full of something that made her breath catch. "But then you stepped off that train, and every day since I have found reasons to be near you. You do not speak, but you communicate more with your silence than most people do with all their words. You work hard and you do not complain, and you look at this harsh land like it is beautiful. And I realized I am not better off alone. I am just lonely and too stubborn to admit it." Lydia pulled out her notebook with shaking hands and wrote quickly. "I was engaged to be married. I caught him with another man. When I told the truth about what I saw, society called me a liar and destroyed my reputation. I stopped speaking because my words only caused pain and no one believed them anyway." Wesley read the note slowly, then read it again. "That is why you came west," he said quietly. "You were not running from a scandal. You were running from people who punished you for telling the truth." She nodded, tears spilling over that she could not stop. "Lydia." Wesley took the notebook gently from her hands and set it aside, then took both her hands in his. "I believe you. And I am sorry that the people who should have protected you failed so completely, but I need you to know something." He waited until she met his eyes. "Your voice matters. What you have to say matters. You do not have to speak if you are not ready, but please know that when and if you ever are ready, I want to hear every word you have to say. The truth is always worth speaking, even when people do not want to hear it." Something broke open inside Lydia's chest, something that had been locked tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. She opened her mouth, tried to form words, but nothing came out. The silence had been her protection for so long that she did not know how to let it go. "It is all right," Wesley said softly. "I am not going anywhere. You take all the time you need." But suddenly it was not all right. Suddenly Lydia wanted desperately to speak, to tell him everything, to hear her own voice saying his name. She tried again, pushing past the fear and the learned helplessness, and managed a sound, barely a whisper, so quiet he leaned closer to hear it. "Wesley." His name, just his name, but the first word she had spoken aloud in 5 months. Wesley's face transformed. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, I am right here." "Wesley," she said again, stronger now, and started crying in earnest. years of held-back words and feelings pouring out in tears. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and she buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed while he held her and murmured quiet reassurances. When the storm finally passed, both the one inside her and the one that had been building on the horizon, they sat together on the porch in the cooling air and watched rain sweep across the prairie in sheets. Lydia's voice was raw and hesitant, but she used it, telling him in broken phrases and long pauses about Boston, about Charles, about the loneliness of not being believed, about the relief of leaving and the terror of starting over. "The train brought me across the country in silence," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain on the roof. 3,000 miles without speaking a word to anyone. I thought the silence was all I had left. Wesley took her hand and threaded his fingers through hers. "Your voice is the sound I have been missing," he said. "I did not even know it until just now, but it is true. These weeks with you have been good, the best I have had in years, but hearing you speak, hearing you trust me enough to use your voice again, that is everything." They sat together as the storm passed and the evening light returned, golden and clean after the rain, and Lydia practiced speaking, telling him small things at first. The names of her parents, her favorite color, the book she had been reading. And Wesley listened to every word as though it was precious, because to him it was. As September arrived and the prairie grass began to turn gold, Wesley and Lydia fell into a new rhythm. He still came by every day, but now they talked while they worked, real conversations instead of companionable silence. Lydia's voice grew stronger, though there were still days when speaking was difficult, when the old fear would rise up, and she would reach for her notebook instead. Wesley never pushed, never made her feel like she had to prove anything. He simply listened when she spoke and read her notes when she did not, and treated both as equally valid. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about coming west to make something of himself, about the hard lessons the land had taught him. She told him about growing up in Boston society, about the expectations and restrictions that had shaped her life, about discovering that everything she had been taught about truth and honor was a lie when it became inconvenient for the people in power. "You miss it?" Wesley asked one day as they rode together across his property, Lydia now confident enough in the saddle to keep up with him. "The city, the culture, the things you had access to there." Lydia considered the question seriously. "I miss some things," she said slowly, her voice still soft but steady. "I miss theater and libraries and the ocean, but I do not miss the people or the pretense or the feeling of being watched and judged every moment. Here I can breathe. Here I can be myself, whoever that turns out to be." "And who is that?" Wesley asked gently. "Who are you, Lydia Evermore, when you strip away all the expectations and just be?" She smiled, looking out over the endless prairie. "I think I am still figuring that out, but I know I am stronger than I thought I was, and braver. And maybe, possibly, I am someone who could be happy here." "Just possibly." Wesley guided his horse closer to hers, close enough that their legs nearly touched. "Probably," Lydia amended, meeting his eyes. "Probably happy here." That evening, Wesley asked if he could court her properly, and Lydia said yes without hesitation, her voice clear and sure. They began spending even more time together, and the neighbors started to notice. Sarah came to visit and was delighted to find her cousin thriving and her old friend obviously smitten. The Millers invited them both to dinner, and then the Harrisons did the same. And slowly Lydia was welcomed into the small community of people who made their lives on this harsh and beautiful land. She found she liked these people far better than Boston society. They were direct and honest, and while they were curious about her past, they did not pry. What mattered to them was that she was a hard worker and a good neighbor, and that Wesley Davenport looked happier than he had in years. That was enough. In October, Wesley took her into Lusk for the monthly dance, and while Lydia did not dance, they stood together and watched the community come together in celebration. Children ran between tables laden with food, old men played fiddles and harmonicas, and couples spun across the rough wooden floor of the town hall. Wesley introduced her to everyone who did not already know her, his hand at the small of her back, his pride in her obvious and unashamed. "You do not have to dance if you do not want to," he said when a particularly lively tune started up. "But I would very much like to, if you are willing." Lydia looked at the dance floor, at the laughing couples, and felt the old fear rise up. She had loved dancing once before everything fell apart, before speaking the truth had cost her everything. "I am not very good anymore," she said quietly. "I do not believe that," Wesley said, offering his hand. "And even if it is true, I do not care. Dance with me, Lydia. Let yourself have this." She took his hand, and he led her onto the floor, and they moved together to the music, and it was nothing like the formal dances in Boston ballrooms. This was wild and free, full of stomping feet and swinging arms and laughter. Wesley was not a practiced dancer, but he was enthusiastic, and his joy was infectious. Lydia found herself laughing, really laughing for the first time since she could remember. "There it is," Wesley said, grinning at her. "That is the sound I was hoping for." When the song ended and another began, they kept dancing, and then another after that, until they were both breathless and flushed. They stumbled outside into the cool evening air, and Wesley pulled her close and kissed her for the first time, gentle and questioning, and Lydia kissed him back with all the words she still did not quite have. "I love you," Wesley said when they finally broke apart. "I know it is fast, but I have never been more sure of anything. I love you, Lydia Evermore, and I want to spend my life with you if you will have me." "I love you too," Lydia whispered, and it was the truth, pure and simple and unafraid. Yes, yes to all of it. Wesley proposed properly in November, on a clear cold day when the first snow was beginning to fall. He took her to the top of the rise behind her barn, where you could see both their properties spread out below, and knelt in the dirt and offered her a simple gold band. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "The only thing of value I own that is not land or livestock. Marry me, Lydia. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that your voice matters, that you matter, that the truth is always worth speaking." "Yes," Lydia said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in December in the small church in Lusk, with Sarah and the Millers and half the community in attendance. Lydia wore a simple dress of deep green wool that she had sewn herself, and Wesley wore his best suit and looked at her like she had hung the stars. The preacher kept the ceremony short because the stove was not keeping up with the cold, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Wesley kissed her in front of everyone, sweet and tender and full of promise. The community held a celebration dinner in the town hall, and Lydia found herself surrounded by well-wishers, by people who genuinely cared about her happiness. She spoke to all of them, sometimes hesitantly but always honestly, and no one questioned or judged. They simply accepted her, silence and voice both, as she was. Wesley had built an addition onto his ranch house for her, a bright room with windows facing east to catch the morning sun and shelves for the books she was slowly acquiring. They combined their properties, running cattle on his land and maintaining the garden and chickens on hers, working together to build something sustainable and good. The first winter was hard, as Wesley had warned her it would be. Snow piled high and temperatures plunged, and there were days when they could not leave the house for the wind and cold. But Lydia found she did not mind. The isolation that might have driven Wesley's first wife mad felt like protection to her, a buffer between her new life and everything she had left behind. And being snowbound with Wesley was no hardship. They talked for hours, learning everything about each other. They cooked together and read aloud to each other and made love in front of the fire while the wind howled outside. "Are you happy?" Wesley asked her one evening in January as they lay tangled together under quilts, the fire burning low. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Lydia said, and meant it completely. "Thank you for finding me, for seeing me, for making me believe my voice mattered." "Your voice is the sound I have been missing my whole life," Wesley said, pulling her closer. "I just did not know it until I heard you speak my name." Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it came new beginnings. Lydia discovered she was pregnant in April, and Wesley was overcome with joy and terror in equal measure. They prepared for the baby together, Wesley building a cradle from cottonwood he cut near the creek, Lydia sewing tiny clothes and blankets. The community rallied around them, the women especially, giving advice and gifts and reassurance. Their son was born in December, a year almost to the day after their wedding, during a snowstorm that made getting the midwife there an adventure Wesley would tell with dramatic flair for years to come. They named him Marcus, after Wesley's father, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's brown eyes, and a set of lungs that announced his presence loudly and often. Lydia had worried that motherhood would silence her again, that the old patterns would resurface under stress and exhaustion. But the opposite happened. She found her voice grew stronger as she sang lullabies to Marcus, as she talked him through his fussiness, as she told him stories about the prairie and the sky and all the things he would learn as he grew. Her voice had returned to her through love, and love made it permanent. Wesley was a devoted father, carrying Marcus everywhere in a sling he fashioned, teaching him the sounds of cattle and horses before he could possibly understand. Lydia watched them together and felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it. 2 years later, their daughter Sarah was born, named after Lydia's cousin who had made this whole new life possible. She was quieter than her brother had been, observing the world with serious eyes, and Lydia recognized something of herself in the child. But Sarah's silence was different from what Lydia's had been. This was the silence of careful observation, of thinking before speaking, and when Sarah did speak, her words were thoughtful and deliberate. The years passed in the good hard work of frontier life. Wesley's cattle operation grew modestly successful, enough to hire more hands and buy more land. Lydia's garden became famous in the area for its productivity, and she began selling preserves and seeds to neighbors. They built a bigger house, still simple, but with room for their growing family and the life they were creating together. Marcus grew into a boy who loved the land as much as his father did, riding before he could barely walk, helping with the cattle as soon as he was old enough. Sarah was quieter, more interested in books and growing things, content to spend hours in the garden with her mother. When she was 5, a third child joined them, another boy they named William, who was wild and joyful and kept them all on their toes. Through it all, Wesley and Lydia remained as connected as they had been in those early days of falling in love. They still worked side by side, still talked for hours, still held each other close on cold nights. The passion between them never faded, only deepened and matured, becoming something richer and more sustaining than simple desire. On their 10th anniversary, Wesley took Lydia back to the spot where he had proposed, and they looked out over the land they had built their life on. "Do you ever regret it?" Wesley asked. "Leaving Boston, giving up everything you knew for this?" Lydia turned to face him, her voice clear and certain in the winter air. I gave up nothing of value and gained everything that matters. I found my voice here, Wesley. I found myself. I found you and our children and a life that is real and true. I have never regretted a single moment. Your voice is still my favorite sound in the world, Wesley said, pulling her close. Every day I get to hear it is a gift. They stood together on the hill, watching smoke rise from their chimney, seeing Marcus chasing William through the snow while Sarah watched from the porch. The prairie stretched away in all directions, vast and harsh and beautiful, and Lydia felt nothing but gratitude for the train that had brought her across the country in silence, for the cowboy who had said her voice was the sound he had been missing, for the life they had built together one true word at a time. As the years continued to unfold, the Davenport family became a fixture in the community around Lusk. Their ranch prospered through hard work and careful management, weathering the inevitable bad years alongside the good ones. Marcus grew into a capable young man who eventually took over more of the cattle operation, while Sarah developed a talent for teaching and began holding lessons for the younger children in the area. William, true to his wild nature, joined the railroad as a surveyor, traveling the territories but always returning home. Lydia continued to find her voice in new ways, becoming an advocate for women in the community who needed support or resources. She was known as someone who would listen without judgment and speak truth without cruelty, and more than one woman found refuge in the Davenport home while escaping difficult circumstances. Wesley supported all of it, proud of the woman his wife had become, the strength she had found in herself. They grew old together on the prairie, their hair turning silver, their hands becoming gnarled with arthritis, but their love never diminishing. On their 30th anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Wesley told the story of how they met, how Lydia had stepped off the train carrying silence like armor, and how he had fallen in love with her before she ever spoke a word. But when she finally did speak, Wesley said, his old eyes still bright when he looked at his wife, when she said my name for the first time, I knew I had been waiting my whole life to hear that sound. Her voice was what had been missing, and once I heard it, I was complete. Lydia took his weathered hand in hers and spoke to the gathered family, her voice still soft but absolutely certain. The train brought me across the country in silence, because I thought my words had no power, no value. But this man, your father and grandfather, he taught me that truth spoken with courage is the most powerful thing in the world. He gave me back my voice by proving it was worth hearing. Everything good in my life came from that gift. They lived many more years together on the land they loved, eventually passing the ranch to Marcus, while they moved into a smaller house near Sarah and her family in town. Wesley's health began to fail in his 73rd year, his heart growing weaker, and Lydia never left his side. She talked to him constantly, filling the air with words, giving him all the voice he had restored to her. On a spring morning when the prairie was green and new, Wesley passed away peacefully with Lydia holding his hand and whispering that she loved him, that she would always love him, that his kindness had saved her life in every way a life can be saved. And though her heart was broken, she continued to use her voice to speak truth, to advocate for others, because that was what he had taught her to do. Lydia lived another 8 years after Wesley's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, all of whom knew the story of the train and the silence, and the cowboy who had said her voice was the sound he had been missing. She passed away quietly one winter evening, and when they laid her to rest beside Wesley in the small cemetery outside Lusk, Sarah read from her mother's journals the words Lydia had written and spoken throughout a long and meaningful life. The last entry, written just days before her death, read, I came to Wyoming broken and silent, believing I had nothing left to offer the world, but I found love that saw past my silence to the person I truly was. I found a voice that had been there all along, just waiting for someone who wanted to hear it. I found a life that was true and real and mine. The train brought me across the country, but Wesley Davenport brought me home. And oh, what a beautiful home it was. Their descendants remained on the land for generations, telling the story of Lydia and Wesley, of the woman who had lost her voice and the man who helped her find it again, of love that transformed silence into song and exile into belonging. And in the small church in Lusk, a plaque was placed in their memory with the inscription, "The train brought her across the country in silence. The cowboy said her voice was the sound he had been missing." Together, they built a life of truth and love that echoed across the prairie for all their days. The story of Lydia and Wesley became part of the fabric of the community, passed down as an example of how love sees what others miss, how truth is always worth speaking, how courage can be found in the most unlikely places. Young women who struggled to find their voices were told about Lydia, about how she had transformed silence into strength. Young men were told about Wesley, about how he had looked past surface appearances to see the person underneath, about how real love gives rather than takes. In the end, their legacy was not just the land they had worked or the children they had raised or the prosperity they had built, though all of that mattered. Their legacy was the simple, profound truth that every voice matters, that every person deserves to be heard, and that love at its best helps us become more fully ourselves rather than less. That was the lesson they taught through their lives together, and it was a lesson that continued to resonate long after they were gone, carried forward by everyone whose life they had touched. The prairie remained vast and harsh and beautiful, indifferent to human joy and sorrow, but the story of the couple who had loved each other there became part of its landscape as surely as the grass and the sky, a reminder that even in the most isolated places, even in the deepest silence, there is always the possibility of connection, of being seen and heard and loved for exactly who you are.